The smell of roast beef filled every corner of the colonial house on Maple Street, just as it had every Sunday for the past 32 years. Amanda Carson pulled into the familiar driveway, her hands gripping the steering wheel of her modest Honda Civic as she stared at the house that had never quite felt like home. The white picket fence gleamed in the afternoon sun, the manicured lawn stretched pristinely toward the street, and the American flag hung motionless from its pole. Everything exactly as her mother insisted it should be. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, smoothing down her brown hair that never seemed to cooperate, adjusting the collar of her simple navy blouse. At 28, Amanda still felt like the awkward teenager who could never measure up to her older brother Michael's achievements or her younger sister Sarah's natural charm. She was the middle child, the forgotten one, the daughter who had somehow slipped through the cracks of her parents' attention. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing her mother Eleanor's perfectly composed smile. "Amanda, darling, you're 10 minutes late," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that familiar undertone of gentle disapproval wrapped in maternal concern. Her mother looked impeccable as always, blonde hair freshly styled at the salon, pearls out, earrings catching the light, wearing a floral dress that probably cost more than Amanda's monthly rent. "Sorry, Mom. Traffic was heavier than I expected," Amanda lied, knowing she had actually sat in her apartment for an extra 15 minutes, gathering the courage to face another Sunday ritual of polite conversation and careful silences. Eleanor's blue eyes scanned Amanda's outfit with barely concealed disappointment. "Well, you're here now. Your father is in his study reviewing some documents for tomorrow's board meeting. Michael and Jennifer are already in the living room with the children, and Sarah called to say she's running a few minutes behind. Something about a last-minute showing with a client." Amanda followed her mother through the marble foyer, past the family portraits that chronicled the Carson legacy, her grandfather's military service, her father's business achievements, Michael's law school graduation, Sarah's real estate awards. Her own college diploma wasn't displayed anywhere. It had been earned at a state school rather than an Ivy League institution, and her degree in social work apparently didn't warrant wall space in the Carson Gallery of Success. The living room buzzed with the comfortable chatter of established family dynamics. Michael sat in their father's old leather chair, his expensive suit impeccable even on a Sunday, discussing market projections with his wife Jennifer, a blonde pediatrician who had seamlessly integrated into the Carson standards. Their twin boys, 8-year-old Tyler and Trevor, played quietly with educational toys designed to stimulate their developing minds toward future success. "Amanda." Jennifer's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to navigate family politics with surgical precision. "How's work going? Still at the community center downtown?" The question hung in the air with its implicit judgment. Amanda worked as a counselor for at-risk youth in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, a job that paid barely enough to cover her studio apartment rent, but fulfilled her in ways her family had never understood. "Yes, still there. Actually, we just got approval for a new after-school program that should—" "That's wonderful, dear," Eleanor interrupted smoothly, her attention already turning toward the dining room. "Michael, would you help me carry the serving dishes? Your father should be joining us any moment." As if summoned by her words, Richard Carson's heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Amanda's chest tightened at the sound. Those same footsteps that had paced the house during her teenage years, usually followed by lectures about responsibility, achievement, and the family name. At 63, her father commanded attention wherever he went. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his weekend clothes still managed to look presidential, and his steel gray eyes missed nothing. "Family," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Lunch is served." The dining room table was set with Eleanor's finest china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier, and enough silverware to host a small embassy function. Amanda took her usual seat, middle of the table between her parents but somehow never quite part of their conversation. She watched as her father carved the roast with military precision while Eleanor orchestrated the passing of side dishes, with the efficiency of a seasoned conductor. "So, Michael," Richard began, his approval evident in his "I heard from Peterson that your closing arguments last week were exceptional. The Henderson case, what?" Michael straightened in, his chair basking in their father's attention. "Yes, sir. We secured a 7-figure settlement for the client. The opposing counsel actually approached me afterward to discuss a potential partnership opportunity." "Outstanding. That's the kind of strategic thinking that builds lasting success." Richard's eyes moved around the table with practiced assessment. Jennifer, how are things at the hospital? Eleanor mentioned you're being considered for department head. The interview process is competitive, but I'm cautiously optimistic, Jennifer replied, her professional confidence evident. The board seems impressed with my patient satisfaction scores and the efficiency improvements I've implemented. Amanda pushed a piece of broccoli around her plate, listening to the familiar symphony of achievement and recognition that never seemed to include her. She thought about Marcus, a 16-year-old she'd been counseling who had finally agreed to return to school after months of truancy, or Maria, whose family had avoided eviction because Amanda had connected them with emergency assistance programs. These victories felt more meaningful than any boardroom triumph, but she knew better than to share them at this. And Sarah should be arriving any moment, Eleanor continued, her voice bright pride. She closed 3 properties this week alone. That girl has such a natural talent for sales. Speaking of natural talent, Richard said, cutting another slice of beef, I ran into Jim Sullivan at the club yesterday. His daughter just made partner at Goldman Sachs, 26 years old and already earning more than most people. See in a lifetime. The comparison hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Amanda felt the familiar burn in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times throughout her childhood, when her achievements were measured against other families' success stories. She took a sip of water, trying to wash down the taste of inadequacy that had become her companion at these. The front door's distinctive chime announced Sarah's arrival, followed by the click of high heels across marble and her sister's melodious laughter echoing there. Sarah Carson Wright entered the dining room like a ray of sunshine, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer dress hugging her figure with confidence, her smile bright enough to power the chandelier. Sorry I'm late, everyone. Sarah's voice carried the easy charm that had always opened her. Mrs. Patterson decided she absolutely had to see one more property, and who am I to argue with a buyer? She kissed their parents' cheeks before settling into her chair with grace. Darling, you look absolutely radiant, Eleanor beamed, her pride palpable. How did the Patterson go? Sold, Sarah announced triumphantly, her water glass in mock toast. She made an offer on the spot, full asking price, no contingencies. I should clear nearly $15,000 in commission just from this afternoon. Richard's approval was immediate and warm. Exceptional work, Sarah. That kind of instinct for reading clients is exactly what separates successful professionals from rest. Amanda watched her sister bask in their parents' praise, remembering how Sarah had always possessed this magnetic quality that drew toward her. Even as children, Sarah had been the one chosen for school plays, invited to parties, surrounded by friends who competed for her attention. Amanda had been the observer, the one who watched from the sidelines and tried to understand what invisible quality lacked. You know, Sarah continued, her voice animating success. I'm thinking about expanding into properties. There's so much potential in the downtown development projects, and I've already established relationships with several majors. Smart thinking, Michael added, his lawyer's mind immediately engaged. I could connect you with some clients who might be interested in real estate investments. Cross-referral opportunities could benefit both sides. Amanda felt herself becoming smaller with each exchange, shrinking into her chair as the conversation swirled around achievements and ambitions that felt foreign to her world. She thought about yesterday's session with Jasmine, a 15-year-old girl whose home life was so chaotic that the community center had become her only stable refuge. Amanda had spent 2 hours just listening, just being present, just helping another human being feel loved. Amanda's been awfully quiet, Jennifer observed, her tone carrying equal interest. How are things with you? All eyes turned toward her, and Amanda felt the familiar flush of being suddenly thrown. Things are good, but good. Still working with those troubled kids downtown? Richard's question carried undertones of disapproval that he didn't bother to disguise. They're not troubled, Dad. They're kids dealing with difficult circumstances. Poverty, family instability, lack of resources. What we do makes a real difference in their lives. I'm sure it does, Eleanor said quickly, her tone designed to smooth over potential conflict. It's very noble work, dear. The word noble landed like a stone in Amanda's stomach. Noble work. The phrase people used when they couldn't think of anything else positive to say about a job that paid poorly and carried no social status. She'd heard it countless times from friends, relatives, and family members who couldn't understand why someone with a college degree would choose to work in an underfunded community center instead of pursuing a real career. Noble or not, Richard continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone that had defined Amanda's childhood, there comes a time when practical considerations have to outweigh idealistic pursuits. You're 28 years old, Amanda. Most of your contemporaries are establishing themselves in careers with growth potential, building toward financial security, starting families. Meanwhile, you're essentially volunteering your skills for subsistence wages. The familiar weight settled on Amanda's shoulders, the weight of disappointed expectations, of being measured against invisible standards and found wanting. She looked around the table at her family's faces, her mother's practiced smile hiding concern, Michael's barely concealed superiority, Jennifer's clinical assessment, Sarah's sympathetic but uncomprehending expression. I'm not volunteering, Dad. I'm working with kids who need support, who need someone to believe in them. The work matters. All work matters, sweetheart, Eleanor interjected gently. But your father has a point about practical considerations. We just want to see you settled and secure. Settled and secure. Code words for married to an acceptable man with an acceptable job, living in an acceptable neighborhood, raising acceptable children who would continue the cycle of acceptable achievement. Amanda had heard these conversations before, had felt the gentle but persistent pressure to conform to their vision of success. I am settled. I have a job I love, an apartment I can afford, friends who matter to me. Just because it doesn't look like your version of success doesn't mean it's not valid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Richard set down his fork with deliberate precision, his gray eyes fixing on Amanda with the focus of a predator sizing up prey. Eleanor's smile became more strained. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Sarah suddenly found her salad. Fascinating. Valid, Richard repeated, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Amanda's pulse quicken. Let me tell you about Valid, Amanda. Valid is building something that lasts. Valid is contributing to society in measurable ways. Valid is taking the advantages you've been given, the education we provided, the opportunities we created, and turning them into something meaningful. Amanda felt the walls of the dining room closing in around her, the familiar sensation of being trapped in expectations she could never meet. Every Sunday for years she had endured these subtle criticisms, these gentle but persistent suggestions that her life choices were somehow insufficient. But today felt different. Today, the frustration that had been building for months, years, was reaching a breaking point. Meaningful to whom? The words escaped before she could stop them. Meaningful according to whose definition? Because helping kids stay in school, preventing teenage pregnancies, connecting families with resources they need to survive, that feels pretty meaningful to me. Don't raise your voice at this table. Richard's command was sharp and immediate. And don't confuse emotional satisfaction with practical impact. Individual charity work, while admirable, doesn't create systemic change. It doesn't build institutions. It doesn't generate wealth that can be leveraged for larger social good. Amanda felt something snap inside her chest, a tension wire that had been stretched taut for decades finally reaching its breaking point. She looked around the table at her family, her successful, accomplished, thoroughly disappointed family, and realized that no amount of explanation would ever make them understand the value of what she... You're right, Dad, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building inside. I don't generate wealth. I don't build institutions. I don't create systemic change. I just help individual human beings survive another day, and apparently that's not enough for this family. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down. Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. Jennifer suddenly became very interested in cutting her roast into perfectly uniform pieces. Sarah's eyes darted between Amanda and their parents like she was watching a tennis match. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreal. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 32 years of accumulated disappointment. 32 years of watching his middle daughter choose paths he couldn't understand or approve. The words that came next would change everything. You know what, Amanda? Richard's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel through skin. His gray eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of a man who had finally decided to speak an uncomfortable. You always were the disappointment of this family. The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the room, contaminating the carefully maintained atmosphere of polite family tradition. Amanda felt them hit her chest with physical force, knocking the breath from her lungs and leaving her momentarily stunned. Around the table, the reactions were immediate and telling. Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, Michael's visible wince, Jennifer's fork clattering against her plate, Sarah's hand flying to cover her mouth. But Amanda said nothing. She sat perfectly, still, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of composure that hid the nuclear explosion happening inside her mind. The disappointment of the words she had always known were true, had always felt lurking beneath every conversation, every comparison, every gentle suggestion that she should do better, be better, become someone more acceptable to. The Carson. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale shock. Can't. Richard's attention remained fixed on Amanda, his voice gaining strength as if speaking the truth had liberated something inside him. Can't acknowledge what we've all been thinking for years? Can't finally address the elephant in this room that we've been tiptoeing around every Sunday for the better part of. Amanda's mind began to fracture, splitting different levels of consciousness. On the surface, she remained seated at the mahogany table, surrounded by her family, the smell of roast beef still heavier. But inside, she was everywhere and nowhere, floating above the scene, watching herself from a distance, and simultaneously diving deep into memories that suddenly demanded. Age 7, sitting at this same table for her birthday dinner, watching her parents fawn over Michael's latest academic achievement while her birthday cake. "We're so proud of Michael," her father had said, his hand resting on her brother's shoulder. "He's going to accomplish." Amanda had waited for similar words about her day, her birthday, her distance. Came. "Dad, please. Stop." Sarah's voice broke through the memory, pulling Amanda back to the present moment. This isn't what? Fair? Honest? Richard's voice rose slightly, his composure cracking to reveal years of suppressed. "Do you know what isn't fair, Sarah? What isn't fair is watching one of your children consistently choose mediocrity when they have every advantage in the world. What isn't fair is watching them waste opportunities that other people for." Amanda listened to her father's words as if they were coming from underwater, distorted. She found herself studying his face, really, looking at him for perhaps the first time in years. The lines around his eyes had deepened, his jaw was set in the familiar expression of righteous authority, and his hands gestured with the practiced movements of a man accustomed to command boardrooms. This was Richard Carson in his element, delivering difficult truths with precision. Age 12, standing in the kitchen while her parents discussed her report cards. "B's and C's," her mother had sighed. "Michael never brought home any." Amanda had tried to explain that she was struggling with math, that she needed help, that she was doing her best. But their disappointment was already set. In stone, another piece of evidence in the case potential. "She's trying her best," Michael said quietly, his lawyer's instincts finally kicking in to dog. "Amanda's work might not be what we'd choose, but she's passionate about it. She's helping people." "Helping people," Richard repeated, his tone making the phrase sound like an accusation. "Everyone helps people, Michael. The difference is that some of us help people while also building something lasting, something significant. Some of us understand that good intentions without results are just self-indulgence." The attack was so clinical, so perfectly aimed at the heart of Amanda's choices, that she almost admired its efficiency. Her father had identified her deepest insecurity, the fear that her work was indeed just emotional self-indulgence rather than meaningful contribution, and wielded it like a weapon. Age 16, announcing that she wanted to major in social work instead of business or pre-law. The silence in the living room had stretched for an eternity before her father spoke. "Social work is a hobby, Amanda, not a career. It's what wealthy women do when they're bored with charity committees." She had tried to explain her passion for helping people, her desire to make a difference in individual lives. He had looked at her with the expression she now recognized as profound disappointment. "Richard, that's enough." Eleanor finally found her voice, though it shook with uncertainty. "Amanda is our daughter, and whatever differences we might have about her choices. Our daughter who is 28 years old and has accomplished nothing of significance." Richard interrupted. "Our daughter who could have used her education and advantages to build something meaningful, but instead chose to play counselor to criminals and dropouts." The word criminals hit Amanda like a slap. She thought about Marcus, whose only crime was being born into poverty. About Jasmine, whose crime was having an absent father and an overworked mother. About David, whose crime was struggling with learning disabilities in an underfunded school system. These weren't criminals. They were kids who needed someone to believe in them, someone to see their potential when the rest of the world had written them off. Age 22, graduation day from State University. While other families celebrated with elaborate parties and proud photos, the Carsons had attended her ceremony with polite smiles and restrained applause. Later at dinner, her father had asked, "So what's your plan now? Have you given more thought to law school or perhaps an MBA program?" When she announced her acceptance of the community center position, the disappointment in his eyes had been unmistakable. Amanda's silence was becoming its own form of communication. She sat perfectly still, absorbing her father's words while her family watched in growing discomfort. The longer she remained quiet, the more unnerved they became. Eleanor's attempts at damage control grew more frantic. Michael's protective instincts warred with his own deeply ingrained respect for their father's authority. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear, and Jennifer sat frozen in clinical observation mode. "You have a college degree," Richard continued, his voice gaining momentum as if years of suppressed frustration were finally finding release. "You have intelligence, family connections, every advantage a young woman could ask for. And what have you done with it? You've chosen to work in a field that pays poverty wages, offers no advancement opportunities, and produces no measurable results." Age 25, announcing that she was dating Tom, a fellow social worker who shared her passion for community service. Her parents had met him exactly once, during a brief and uncomfortable dinner where his humble background and idealistic career goals had been received with polite horror. "He seems very nice," Eleanor had said afterward, the same tone she might use to describe a pleasant but inappropriate suitor. The relationship had ended 6 months later, partly due to the constant pressure of knowing her family considered him unsuitable. The measurable results, Amanda finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear, are kids who graduate instead of dropping out. Families who stay together instead of falling apart. Young people who believe in themselves enough to pursue education instead of giving up. But I suppose those results don't show up on your balance sheet. "Don't be sarcastic with me," Richard's voice sharpened. "Individual anecdotes aren't data, Amanda. Feel-good stories aren't policy. What you're doing is putting band-aids on systemic problems while feeling virtuous about your sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air between. Amanda realized that her father saw her entire career, her entire life's work, as a form of self-imposed martyrdom rather than genuine calling. To him, she was playing at being poor, playing at being helpful, indulging in elaborate performance of nobility, while failing to embrace her true potential. Age 28, 3 weeks ago, receiving recognition from the city council for her work with at-risk. She had called to share the news, excited for once to have something that might make her parents proud. "That's nice, dear," her mother said. "Your father's in a meeting, but I'll tell." He had never called back to congratulate her. The recognition certificate now sat in a drawer, another achievement that didn't count in the Carson family. "Me?" Amanda said slowly, her voice gaining. "My sacrifice is living in a world where helping individual human beings is considered less valuable than accumulating wealth and status. Maybe my sacrifice is being part of a family that measures success by bank accounts and social position instead of by the lives you touch and the difference." The room's temperature seemed to drop another. Michael shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous territory they were in. Eleanor's eyes darted between her husband and daughter, like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Sarah had gone completely pale. Her usual confidence evaporated in the face of this family civil war. "The difference you make," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with din. "Tell me about the difference you've made, Amanda. Give me concrete examples of how your noble sacrifice has changed anything significant in the world." Hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in medieval combat. Amanda felt the weight of every success story she couldn't share, every small victory that would sound insignificant when measured against her family's standard achievement. How do you explain the value of being present when a 16-year-old girl finally trusts someone enough to admit she's being abused? How do you quantify the importance of helping a mother navigate the bureaucracy to get food assistance for her children every session with Marcus, watching him slowly open up about his fears and dreams, every conversation with Maria's mother, helping her understand her rights, and every group meeting where kids who had been written off by everyone else found their voices and started believing in their own potential. Every small breakthrough, every moment of connection, every life that shifted just slightly toward hope. Instead, "The difference I make," Amanda said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest, is that kids who everyone else has given up on know that at least one person believes they're living. The difference I make is that families facing eviction or hunger or legal problems have somewhere to turn when the systems that are supposed to help fail. The difference I make is that young people who've been told their entire lives that they're worthless discover they have value potential. Potential? Richard scoffed. More feel-good language. What does that potential actually become? How many of these kids graduate college? How many build success? How many break the cycle of poverty and dysfunction? Do you have statistics, Amanda? Do you have data? Or just more heartwarming stories about making people? The questions hit Amanda like physical blows because they exposed the central challenge of her work, the difficulty of measuring impact in human terms rather than numerics. She thought about the kids she'd lost touch with, the ones who had disappeared back into the cycle of poverty and struggle despite her efforts. She thought about the successes too. Marcus had just been accepted to community college. Jasmine had stayed in school and was talking about studying nursing. David had found ways to work around his learning disabilities and was thriving. But she also understood her father's point. Individual successes, while meaningful, didn't constitute systemic change. She was treating symptoms rather than diseases, applying band-aids rather than performing surgery on problems. The realization was both devastating and clarifying. "You're right," she said quietly, the admission seeming to surprise everyone at the table. "I don't have statistics. I don't have data that would impress a board of directors or look good in an annual report. What I have are individual human beings who are slightly better equipped to face their challenges because someone took the time to listen, to care, to help them themselves. And that's exactly the problem." Richard's voice carried a note of triumph, as if she had finally admitted what he'd been trying to prolong. "You've confused emotional satisfaction with actual accomplishment. You've prioritized feeling good about yourself over doing good in the world." The accusation landed with devastating accuracy. Amanda felt something break apart inside her chest, a protective barrier she had built around her choices, her career, her entire adult identity. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider the possibility that her father might be right, that her work was indeed a form of elaborate self-indulgence, that she had chosen the path of least resistance by surrounding herself with grateful recipients of her help, rather than facing the harder challenge of building something lasting and significant. The silence that followed stretched taut between them, filled with years of accumulated disappointment, misunderstanding, and fundamental differences about what constituted a life well lived. Amanda looked around the table at her family, her successful, accomplished, thoroughly convinced family, and realized they were looking at a stranger. She had always been the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit, the disappointment who had never lived up to their expectations or embraced their values. The weight of that realization was both crushing and oddly liberating. Amanda's mind had become a kaleidoscope, fragments of memory spinning and reshaping themselves as she sat, frozen at the dinner table. Her father's words, "You always were the disappointment of this family," had broken something fundamental inside her, shattered the carefully constructed walls she'd built around the most painful moments of her childhood. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, its weight pressing down on her chest until breathing became a conscious effort. Now decades of carefully suppressed moments came flooding back with crystal clarity, each memory arriving with the visceral intensity of relived experience rather than distant recollection. The dining room around her seemed to shift and blur, the familiar space becoming dreamlike and unstable. She could still hear the faint clinking of silverware against bone china, the sound somehow both immediate and distant, as if filtered through water. The smell of roast beef growing cold on her plate mingled with the lingering scent of Eleanor's signature candles, vanilla and sandalwood, the same combination that had perfumed every family gathering for as long as she could remember. She felt the weight of her family's stares pressing against her skin like a physical touch. Their collective attention finally focused on her, but for all the wrong reasons. But simultaneously, she was everywhere else. Every significant moment of her life playing out in parallel like a film projected onto multiple screens, each scene demanding to be witnessed and understood with an urgency that left her breathless. Age 5. Standing in the doorway of her father's study while he worked late into the night, the room illuminated by the warm glow of his brass desk lamp. The study had always felt sacred to her then, leather-bound books reaching toward the ceiling, the rich scent of mahogany furniture polish, the soft scratch of his fountain pen against expensive paper. She had wanted to show him a drawing she'd made at kindergarten that afternoon, A family portrait with all of them holding hands under a rainbow, their stick figure bodies adorned with careful details she'd added during quiet time. She'd given herself pigtails like the ones Eleanor braided each morning, drawn Marcus with the gap between his front teeth that made him whistle when he talked, and depicted Sarah with the curly hair she was always so proud. Her father stood, tallest in the center, wearing what she'd interpreted as his work smile, the expression he wore when important people visited the house. "Not now, Amanda," he'd said without looking up from his papers, his voice carrying that particular tone of distraction she would later recognize in her own interactions with interrupting students. "Daddy's busy with important work." The word important had struck her even then, though she couldn't articulate why. She had left the drawing on his desk anyway, positioning it carefully beside his coffee cup where he couldn't miss it, hoping he'd see it later when he finished whatever was more important than her rainbow family. The next morning, she found it in the wastebasket, crumpled beneath coffee-stained reports and discarded memos. The bright crayons she'd chosen so carefully, yellow for the sun that she'd added rays to until it looked properly warm, green for the grass where they all stood smiling with their arms stretched wide to show how much they loved each other, had seemed to mock her from among the refuse of her father's more pressing concerns. She'd stood there in her nightgown, bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, staring at her family's crumpled faces, and understanding for the first time that love and importance existed in different categories entirely. The memory hit her with unexpected force, that 5-year-old's confusion and hurt mixing with her adult understanding of patterns that had defined their relationship for decades. She realized now that it hadn't been personal rejection. Her father simply operated in a world where children's artwork didn't qualify as important, where emotional expressions were secondary to practical achievements, where love was assumed rather than demonstrated. His universe ran on deadlines and profit margins, board meetings and quarterly reports, tangible accomplishments that could be measured and could. But understanding the pattern didn't diminish the ache of that small girl who had spent an hour choosing just the right colors, testing each crayon on scrap paper to make sure it was exactly the shade she wanted, who had believed that love could be captured in crayon strokes and presented as a gift worthy of her father's attention. The rational adult Amanda could forgive the distracted father, but the child Amanda remained frozen in that moment of discovery, staring at her crumpled family and learning her first lesson about where she ranked in the hierarchy of importance. "Amanda?" Eleanor's voice seemed to come from far away, pulling her partially back to the present moment like a lifeline thrown across deck. "Sweetheart, are you all right? You look..." The concern in her mother's voice was genuine, tinged with the particular anxiety Eleanor reserved for situations that might create a scene or draw unwanted attention to family dinner. She turned toward her mother's concerned face, seeing it layered with all the other expressions Eleanor had worn throughout Amanda's childhood. The practiced smile during school conferences when teachers praised Amanda's kindness but worried about her academic performance, those careful conversations about reaching her potential and applying herself more diligently. She saw the subtle disappointment when Amanda chose State University over the private colleges her siblings attended, Eleanor's attempts to explain the decision to friends at the country club with phrases like, she wanted to stay close to home, and sometimes the state schools have excellent programs. There were the gentle but persistent suggestions about more suitable career paths, conversations that always began with, have you considered, and ended with reminders about security and stability and the importance of practical thinking. Age 8, sitting in the backseat of the Mercedes while Eleanor drove her to a birthday party for one of Sarah's friends. Amanda hadn't been invited. Sarah was only 6 but already more popular, more charming, more everything that mattered in their circle. "Why can't I come to the party too?" Amanda had asked. Eleanor's response had been gentle, definitive. "This party is for Sarah's age group, dear. Besides, you have that book replenish." Even at 8, Amanda had understood the subtext. Sarah belonged at parties while Amanda belonged work. But now, layered with adult perspective, she could see her mother's reflection in the rearview mirror during that drive. The tightness around Eleanor's eyes that suggested her own discomfort with the social hierarchies she nonetheless. Eleanor had pulled into their circular driveway that day and sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, before turning to face Amanda directly. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes the most interesting people are the ones who spend time with books and studies." It had been meant as comfort, but Amanda remembered feeling like consolation prize personified. Interesting enough, for her mother's pity, but not quite enough. Age 12, the science fair where Amanda's project on local butterfly migration patterns had earned third place. She'd spent weeks cataloging species in the woods behind their house, photographing cocoons and documenting emergence patterns with the methodical care that would later serve her well in her research career. Her father had attended, arriving just as the judges announced winners. Third place, he'd said, not quite a question, but not acceptance either. Well, I suppose something. He'd left early to take a conference call, missing her presentation entirely. Amanda had stood beside her carefully mounted displays, watching other children's parents ask detailed questions about methodology and findings, while she fielded polite inquiries alone. Marcus had won first place that year with a volcano that produced impressively large eruptions, but demonstrated no particular scientific insight. Their father had spent 20 minutes examining Marcus's project, asking technical questions about chemical reactions, and discussing application. Amanda had watched from 3 tables away, her butterfly photographs suddenly seeming small and insignificant, her careful documentation feeling childish compared to Marcus's techniques. Age 15, the conversation that had shaped her understanding of family expectations forever. She'd announced her intention to major in environmental science, inspired by years of solitary exploration in those same woods where she'd first studied butterflies. Eleanor had been folding laundry in the master bedroom, creating perfect stacks of her father's shirts, while CNN played quietly in the background. Environmental science, Eleanor had repeated, her hands never pausing in their precise folding motions. That's certainly idealistic, dear. But have you considered something more practical? Sarah's showing such promise in business, and Marcus is already thinking about law school. Perhaps you could look into education. Teaching is such a stable career for women. The words had landed with the soft impact of silk against marble, gentle but immovable. Amanda had tried to explain her passion for conservation research, her dreams of protecting ecosystems, her vision of contributing to scientific understanding of environmental crisis. Eleanor had listened with the patient attention she gave to all of Amanda's enthusiasms, the kind of listening that made it clear the speaker was being indulged rather than heard. Of course, sweetheart, but you have to think practically. Environmental. Science is such a niche field and not very lucrative. You want to be able to support yourself comfortably, don't you? Maybe you could teach environmental science at a nice private school. That would combine your interest with security. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Amanda could see how that conversation had crystallized her sense of herself as someone whose dreams required translation into more acceptable forms, whose passions needed to be rendered practical before they could be acknowledged. She had, in fact, become an environmental scientist, though she'd never shared the details of her work with her family. The peer-reviewed publications, the conference presentations, the grant funding she'd secured for wetland preservation projects. None of it had seemed worth mentioning in a context where success was measured in different currencies entirely. Age 18, graduation day, standing in her cap and gown while her family arranged themselves for photographs. Sarah, only 16, had somehow managed to position herself at the center of every shot, her natural charisma drawing the camera's focus even at Amanda's own graduation. Their father had been checking his phone throughout the ceremony, responding to emails that couldn't wait even for this milestone moment. "Smile bigger, Amanda," the photographer had coached. "This is your special day." But Amanda had felt like a supporting character at her own celebration, watching her family's attention drift toward more compelling subjects, even as they documented what should have been her moment of achievement. The photographs from that day still sat in Eleanor's formal living room, Amanda's uncertain smile frozen beside Sarah's radiant grin and Marcus's confident pose. In every image, Amanda appeared slightly out of focus, as if the camera itself had struggled to see her clearly. Back in the present moment, the dinner table conversation continued around her, voices rising and falling in familiar patterns of dominance and deference. But Amanda remained suspended between past and present, finally understanding the architecture of her own invisibility, seeing with devastating clarity how decades of small moments had constructed the prison of low expectations in which she'd learned to live. "I'm fine, Mom," Amanda heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow, as if someone else were speaking through her vocal cords while her real self remained trapped somewhere deep inside, observing this familiar performance with growing detachment. The words felt rehearsed, automatic, worn smooth like river stones from years of repetition, a response she'd given countless times before when the weight of family expectations pressed down on her shoulders like a lead blanket, suffocating and inescapable. Her tongue felt thick and foreign in her mouth, and she noticed how her hands had unconsciously clenched into fists beneath the table. Knuckles white with tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Just thinking about. Richard's voice carried a sharp edge of impatience that cut through the afternoon air like a blade fresh from the whetstone, each word precisely enunciated with the kind of controlled aggression he typically reserved for boardroom negotiations when subordinates failed to meet his standards. His fork clinked against his plate as he set it down with deliberate precision, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the dining room like a shroud. The silverware seemed to ring against the fine china with an almost musical quality, though the note it struck was discordant. Amanda could see the muscle in his jaw working, the way it always did when he was restraining himself from saying something even harsher, his businessman's train measured response warring with his paternal frustration. About how you're going to respond to what I said? Because I meant every word, Amanda. Every single syllable was carefully chosen and intentional. This family has supported your choices for years, financially, emotionally, practically, writing checks for your education, providing connections when you needed them, hoping against hope that you'd eventually find your direction, that this phase would pass like some extended adolescent rebellion. But watching you waste your potential has become genuinely painful, like watching someone slowly destroy something precious and irreplaceable. It's like watching someone with perfect pitch choose to sing off-key, day after day, year after year, not from inability but from some perverse determination to remain mediocre. The word potential hit Amanda like a physical blow, triggering another cascade of memories that crashed over her consciousness in waves, each one adding weight to the growing, crushing understanding of how she had been perceived throughout life. Not as a person with her own valid dreams and aspirations, but as a collection of unrealized possibilities that belonged more to her family than. The memories came in waves now, no longer gentle recollections drifting through. Her awareness, but urgent, insistent visions that demanded her attention with the force of suppressed truths finally breaking free. She could feel her pulse quickening, her breathing becoming shallow as each recovered memory added another layer to the suffocating realization that she had never been seen as herself, only as a potential version of. Age 10. Parent-teacher. Conference in Mrs. Henderson's classroom with its cheerful bulletin boards covered in student artwork and motivational posters. The lingering scent of construction paper and glue sticks mixing with the afternoon sunlight that streamed through, windows decorated with paper snowflakes left over from the winter months. Amanda had been sitting in one of those tiny plastic chairs designed for children, her legs swinging nervously as the adults talked over her head, discussing her future as if she were an interesting science project, rather than a little girl with her own thoughts. The chair was uncomfortable, too small for her growing body, and she remembered how her legs had gone numb from sitting still for so long, how she desperately wanted to fidget, but had been trained to sit quietly when talking. Henderson had praised Amanda's emotional intelligence and natural ability to help other children work through conflicts, her voice warm with genuine admiration and the kind of professional satisfaction that came from recognizing something special in a student. She has such a gift for understanding people, the teacher had said, gesturing toward Amanda with motherly pride that made Amanda's chest swell with unexpectedness. Just last week, she helped 2 classmates resolve a dispute that had been going on for weeks, turning what could have been a permanent rift into a bond. She listens in a way that makes children feel truly heard and valued, not hated. She could be an excellent counselor or social worker someday. She has that rare combination of empathy and wisdom that you can't really teach, that either exists naturally or doesn't. Richard's response had been swift and dismissive, his businessman's pragmatism cutting through the teacher's enthusiasm like ice water thrown on a warming fire, extinguishing something precious without a second thought. Amanda could still remember the way his posture had shifted, becoming more formal, authoritative, the way he'd straightened his tie unconsciously as if preparing for a business. She has potential for much more than that, he had said, his tone carrying the same dismissive certainty he used when rejecting inadequate bizzles. We're hoping she'll set her sights higher, perhaps psychology with an eye toward research and publication, or law with a focus on family advocacy, maybe even psychiatry if she has the academic discipline. Medical school. Something that uses her people skills but offers real opportunities for advancement and financial security, something that builds toward something greater. Amanda had been sitting right there, small hands folded carefully in her lap the way she'd been taught, listening to her father dismiss her natural talents as insufficient stepping stones rather than destinations worth pursuing, watching him reduce her teacher's enthusiasm to naive idealism that needed correction. "You talk about my potential like it's something I've squandered," Amanda said, her voice growing stronger as memories continued to surface, each one adding another layer to her understanding of how this moment had been building for years. "But what if my potential was never what you thought it was? What if I actually fulfilled exactly the potential I was meant to have? What if your version of my potential was really just your version of your own unfulfilled ambitions projected onto me?" Michael leaned forward, his lawyer instincts sensing an opportunity to mediate before the conversation became irreparable. His tie was slightly loosened now, his Sunday afternoon composure beginning to crack under the strain of family dynamics he usually managed to avoid. "Amanda has a point, Dad. Success isn't just about money or status. She's found work that matches her natural abilities, and she's good at it. Really good. The kids at her center? Natural abilities," Richard interrupted with a bitter laugh that held no warmth, no humor, only the sharp edge of frustration that had been building for years. He pushed back from the table slightly, his businessman's posture asserting itself as he prepared to make his case. "Let me tell you about natural abilities, Michael. Natural abilities without ambition are worthless. Natural abilities without the drive to maximize them are just wasted talent-gathering dust." Amanda could have used her so-called gift for understanding. People to become an excellent therapist with a private practice, building a client base, perhaps writing books, maybe even consulting for corporations on employee relations. Or a social worker who moves into administration and policy making, someone who shapes systems rather than just working within them. Instead, she's chosen to remain in an entry-level position, helping the same small group of troubled kids year after year, with no plan for growth, no vision for expanding her impact. Another memory surfaced, this one from age 14. During the summer, she had volunteered at a local homeless shelter. She could still smell the industrial disinfectant and hear the constant hum of conversation in the dining hall. She had come home every day that summer, excited to share stories about the people she'd met and helped. Mr. Rodriguez, who had been a teacher before losing his job and apartment. Sarah, a teenage mother trying to get back on her feet. Old Tom, who had more wisdom about human nature than anyone she'd ever met. Her parents had listened with polite attention, but she could see the concern growing in their eyes with each enthusiastic recounting of her day. "It's wonderful that you want to help people, dear," Eleanor had said carefully one evening, her voice carrying that particular tone parents use when they're trying to redirect without crushing. "But you need to be realistic about your future. Helping people can be part of any career. Doctors help people by healing them. Lawyers help people by fighting for justice. Business leaders help people by creating jobs and economic opportunity. You don't have to limit yourself to direct service work." The pause before direct service work had been telling, as if her mother were searching for a polite way to describe something distasteful. The pattern was becoming clearer with each recovered memory, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Her family hadn't rejected her desire to help people. They had rejected her vision of how that help should be delivered. They wanted her to help from positions of power and authority, to be the kind of person who wrote checks to charitable organizations, rather than working directly with the people who needed assistance. They wanted her to help people the way successful people help people, from a distance with resources and influence rather than presence and empathy. "Maybe," Amanda said slowly, each word carefully chosen as she finally began to articulate thoughts she'd never dared voice before. "The problem isn't that I've wasted my potential. Maybe the problem is that you never understood what my potential actually was. Maybe you looked at a child who was naturally drawn to helping others and decided that wasn't valuable. Maybe you took my greatest strength and decided it needed to be something else, something bigger, more impressive, more worthy of dinner party conversation." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her discomfort with conflict making her fidget with her nap. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over family tensions with jokes or subject change. "Can we please just finish lunch? This is getting way too intense for Sunday dinner. Maybe we could talk about something." "No." Amanda's voice was firm, surprising everyone, including herself. The word came out with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, cutting through years of polite deflection and family maintenance. "I think it's time we talked about this honestly. I've spent 28 years apologizing for not being the daughter you wanted me to be. I've listened to suggestions about changing careers, changing boyfriends, changing my entire approach. life, changing everything about myself except the core of who I am. But I've never asked you to explain why my choices are wrong beyond the fact that they don't match your definition of success. I've never asked you to justify why your vision of my life should matter more than my own vision of my life. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet moments. This was charged, electric with possibility and dare. Eleanor's hand moved to her pearls, a nervous gesture Amanda had seen countless times but never really noticed. Richard's jaw tightened in the way it did when he was preparing for a difficult negotiation. Michael looked between his parents and his sister as if he were watching a tennis match that might suddenly turn violent. And I think, Amanda continued, her voice gaining momentum like a river breaking through, it's time I asked you some questions. Like why my happiness doesn't factor into your definition of success for me. Like why you've never once asked me if I like my work, if it fulfills me, if I wake up in the morning feeling grateful for the chance to do what I do. Like why you assume that because I'm not climbing some ladder you've built in your minds, I must be stagnating or failing or wasting. Age 17, the night before prom when she had announced she wasn't going because she didn't participate in what she saw as an expensive popularity contest. Richard had exploded, not because he cared about the dance itself, but because her absence would require explanation to other parents in their soul. What am I supposed to tell the Johnsons when they ask why Amanda isn't there? He had demanded. How do I explain that my daughter prefers to make political statements instead of participating in normal teenage? She had gone to the prom, wearing a dress that cost more than most families spent on groceries, and felt miserable the entire night. Your choices are wrong, Richard said, his voice gaining intensity with each word, the familiar edge of intellectual superiority creeping into his tone like a blade being slowly unsheathed. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a gay, nervous habit that had always preceded his most cutting observations. They're wrong because they're fundamentally, irredeemably selfish. You've convinced yourself that working with poor kids makes you noble, that it somehow elevates you above the rest of us who chose more conventional paths. But what you're really doing is avoiding the harder challenges of real leadership. It's easier, isn't it, to be appreciated by grateful teenagers who worship you for showing up, than to compete in environments where your performance is actually measured against your peers, where your limitations would be exposed. The accusation of selfishness hit Amanda like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her momentarily speechless. The word reverberated in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her consciousness like an echo in an empty room. She had spent her entire adult life in service to others, earning poverty wages that barely covered her basic expenses, while trying to make a meaningful difference in individual lives, one conversation at a time, one small victory at a time. The irony was so sharp it felt like swallowing glass. How could that possibly be characterized as selfish? How could years of sacrifice, of choosing purpose over profit, of staying late to tutor struggling students or counsel heartbroken teenagers, be twisted into something so ugly and self-serving? The memory surfaced unbidden, as painful memories always do in moments of vulnerability. Age 21, standing in Richard's pristine apartment with its carefully curated book collection and expensive furniture, the conversation where she had tried to explain her decision to work at the community center after graduation. The excitement in her voice had been genuine, born from months of volunteer work that had shown her a world she never knew existed. I want to do work that matters, she had said, the words carrying all the idealism and hope of someone who still believed she could change the world. Richard's response had been immediate and harsh, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon making an incision. All work matters, Amanda. The question is whether you want to do work that matters to you personally or work that matters to society as a whole. Personal satisfaction is a luxury that comes after you've established yourself professionally. Until then, it's just narcissism disguised as altruism. Selfish, Amanda repeated now, the word rolling off her tongue like poison, bitter and toxic. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room it sounded like a gunshot. I'm selfish because I work with kids who have no one else advocating for them, who come from homes where education isn't valued or even possible. I'm selfish because I chose meaningful work over a prestigious salary and the social status that comes with it. I'm selfish because I've tried to use whatever gifts I have, modest as they may be, to help people who actually need help, who don't have the luxury of choosing between opportunities because they have no opportunities at all. Her hands were trembling now, and she clasped them together to stop the shaking. The familiar knot of anxiety was forming in her stomach, the same sick feeling she always got when Richard dissected her choices with his relentless logic. "You're selfish." Richard's voice was relentless, each word delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deepest where she was most vulnerable. "Because you've chosen work that makes you feel good about yourself, rather than work that creates lasting systemic change. You've deliberately surrounded yourself with people who are grateful for any attention, any help, any small kindness. Because their expectations have been so systematically lowered by society that minimal effort seems heroic. It's a calculated choice, Amanda, conscious or not, to be the savior figure in a context where the bar for heroism is set impossibly low." The words were devastating in their precision, like arrows fired by an expert archer who knew exactly where the armor was weakest. Amanda felt them slice through her carefully constructed defenses and expose fears she had never fully acknowledged, doubts that lived in the darkest corners of her mind where she tried never to vent. Had she unconsciously chosen work that would make her feel important, special, neat? Was her altruism just another form of ego, dressed up in the clothes of service? The questions multiplied in her mind like a virus, infecting every memory of satisfaction she had ever felt in her work, every moment of pride when a student succeeded or a program made a difference. "Your choices are wrong," Rich said, his voice gaining intensity with each word, the familiar edge of intellectual superiority creeping into his tone like a blade being slowly His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a nervous habit that had always preceded his most cutting observation. "They're wrong because they're fundamentally, irredeemably selfish. You've convinced yourself that working with poor kids makes you noble, that it somehow elevates you above the rest of us who chose more conventional paths. But what you're really doing is avoiding the harder challenges of real. It's easier, isn't it, to be appreciated by grateful teenagers who worship you for showing up, than to compete in environments where your performance is actually measured against your peers, where your limitations would be exposed." The accusation of selfishness hit Amanda like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her momentarily speechless. The word reverberated in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her consciousness like an echo in empty. She had spent her entire adult life in service to others, earning poverty wages that barely covered her basic expenses, while trying to make a meaningful difference in individual lives, one conversation at a time, one small victory at a time. The irony was so sharp it felt like swallowing. How could that possibly be characterized as fish? How could years of sacrifice, of choosing purpose over profit, of staying late to tutor struggling students or counsel heartbroken teenagers, be twisted into something so ugly and self-serving? The memory surfaced unbidden, as painful memories always do in moments of vulnerability. Age 21, standing in Richard's pristine apartment with its carefully curated book collection and expensive furniture, the conversation where she had tried to explain her decision to work at the community center after graduation. The excitement in her voice had been genuine, born from months of volunteer work that had shown her a world she never knew. "I want to do work that matters," she had said, the words carrying all the idealism and hope of someone who still believed she could change. Richard's response had been immediate and harsh, delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon making vision. "All work matters, Amanda. The question is whether you want to do work that matters to you personally or work that matters to society as a whole. Personal satisfaction is a luxury that comes after you've established yourself professionally. Until then, it's just narcissism disguised as ism." "Selfish," Amanda repeated now, the word rolling off her tongue like poison, bitter and toxic. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room it sounded like, "I'm selfish because I work with kids who have no one else advocating for them, who come from homes where education isn't valued or even possible. I'm selfish because I chose meaningful work over a prestigious salary and the social status with it. I'm selfish because I've tried to use whatever gifts I have, modest as they may be, to help people who actually need help, who don't have the luxury of choosing between opportunities because they have no opportunity at all." Her hands were trembling now, and she clasped them together to sing. The familiar knot of anxiety was forming in her stomach, the same sick feeling she always got when Richard dissected her choices with his logic. "You're selfish." Richard's voice was relentless, each word delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deepest where she was most vulnerable. Because you've chosen work that makes you feel good about yourself, rather than work that creates lasting change. You've deliberately surrounded yourself with people who are grateful for any attention, any help, any kindness. Because their expectations have been so systematically lowered by society that minimal effort seems heroic. It's a calculated choice, Amanda, conscious or not, to be the savior figure in a context where the bar for heroism is set in low. The words were devastating in their precision, like arrows fired by an expert archer who knew exactly where the arm weakest. Amanda felt them slice through her carefully constructed defenses and expose fears she had never fully acknowledged, doubts that lived in the darkest corners of her mind where she tried venture. Was he right? Had she unconsciously chosen work that would make her feel important, special, needed? Was her altruism just another form of ego, dressed up in the crevice? The questions multiplied in her mind like a virus, infecting every memory of satisfaction she had ever felt in her work, every moment of pride when a student succeeded or a program made a difference.